Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks to Simon for carving out time to read the book and comment on it. And thanks to you all for coming. It's great to be able to put something back into ODI, apart from coming to council meetings, and to have a conversation here about an issue which I increasingly feel is at the very center of questions regarding the future of development, but also more broadly the future of the world. And the reason I wrote this book was really bringing together a lot of the experience that I've had in different institutions, in different roles over the years, with my writing on different aspects of globalization. And I've written mainly on economics, but also on migration, on the environment, and other topics over time. And coming to a sense that there needs to be a much wider and deeper debate about how the world is managed, and particularly how these institutions are evolving, and a call for action in a way to involve citizens in that. And so the book is written not in my normal, rather boring academic style, but hopefully in a more accessible way, because it's my first attempt to write a book for a broad audience. So tell me if I've succeeded or if I'm still too caught up in jargon and things once you've had a chance to look at it. And that's because I think citizens need to get a lot more active on this. I used to beat up on the institutions, and I've been involved in many, many reform efforts of the UN, of the Bretton Woods institutions, and others. And I used to get angry with the leadership for not showing enough vision, with the people that work in these institutions for not showing enough guts and ability to solve the world's problems. But I increasingly feel, in a sense, that that's unfair, that where we should really place the blame is on ourselves, because we as citizens are not demanding of our governments more action on the global institutions. And it's our governments that basically are stifling these institutions. Our governments don't want these institutions to be more effective, and they control them. If they wanted them to be more effective, they would be more effective. And it's the benign neglect of these institutions. It's the benign neglect of global governance. And I believe this is getting worse, not better. In other words, we're becoming more inward-looking, not less, that I believe is at the root of the problem. And if we say that our governments have a benign neglect for global governance, then we must say that's because we want it so, because we get the governments we deserve through voting through them, through elections and other means. Perhaps that's less so if you're in a non-democratic government, but I think in a democratic government, that's what citizens are saying. So that's why this book is aimed at us. It's aimed at citizens. It's aimed at my friends, to get them to be more active and to try and raise the significance of this particular aspect of politics. The way I come to this is from a very close proximity, particularly to finance in recent decades, and a recognition in the financial crisis that the pace of globalization, of technological change, of joined-upness in the world has evolved in a really radical way, particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I see a structural break in the world over the last 25 years or so, but particularly since what I characterize as the coming down of walls, symbolized by the coming down of the Berlin Wall. But clearly things have been happening in many, many other countries, and not least the country that I was most involved in, South Africa. But what's happened there is, of course, not only about South Africa. It's happened across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and fundamentally transformative in Eastern Europe as well as in some very big countries like China. And the level of connectiveness, the level of integration is, I believe, the best thing that's happened perhaps in human history. The potential for walls to come down and for people to be exposed to ideas, to technologies, to opportunities at a pace and with a breadth in terms of global reach that really was unimaginable in a more divided world. And the title is partly a play on that, divided and united world, but it's obviously a play on the concept of the United Nations as well. And so what we have in this period of hyperglobalization is the most rapid progress that the world's ever known along many, many, many indicators, particularly human development indicators, life expectancy, incomes, infant mortality, etc. And virtually any indicator you look at, you see this improvement, which I attribute to openness, connectivity, integration, what some might call globalization. This is a source of very good news, but it's also a source of the problems that we have. And understanding this dual of globalization, how it is both a force for good, but also extremely dangerous, is, I believe, at the heart of understanding the question of governance. So we want to be more integrated, we want to be more open, we want to seize the opportunities and the leapfrogging in innovation that can come through that, not least in the sharing of ideas, whether they're simple ideas like washing hands or having vaccines, or big ideas like how to run economies and political systems, how to seize opportunity. But as we all become more tightly bound up, the externalities associated with our actions get bigger. And as 4 billion people move up the curve of moving from about $1,000 per capita up to $10,000 per capita, what's rational for individuals, which is to consume more, whether it's the amount of fish they have, or the land they use, or the carbon dioxide they use, or anything else, the amount of antibiotics they use, all rational for individuals. And the more we believe that's our choice, and we have the income to exercise our choices, the more irrational the global consequences. And that's why, as we get more tightly bound up with each other, global governance becomes more and more important, not less and less. And yet we've paradoxically found that as the world has globalized and as we become richer, we see global governance as less of a demand, less of a political demand, and less of an institutional demand. And so we're stuck with these institutions which are essentially created out of the Second World War for totally different global governance, totally fragmented world. Many of the issues we have, like climate change, like cyber, like migration, don't even have a global institution. Others, like pandemics do, like finance do, but we find even in those that the institutions are unfit for purpose. And I've just selected in this book 5 indicative global questions, not because I believe they're the most important and that the others are not, like nuclear war or poverty, which of course worked a lot on and I care deeply about, but because I think they're indicative of the type of changes and the lag between how things have evolved and how the governance system has not kept pace with it. Finance, to me, is the most intriguing because it is the best of the global systems. As is the case in the UK, where the Treasury and Bank of England are the strongest of the national institutions. They have the best people in the civil service, they have the most resources, and they have the best data, certainly in the public civil service outside the intelligence services. And the same is true at the global level, and the same is true in all countries. In the US, the Fed and the Treasury are the most powerful national institutions. At the global level, the IMF, the BIS, these institutions are the most powerful of the global institutions. They're the most joined up, they have the most competitive entry and the best staff, best data, and of course the salaries in the IMF are higher than in any other a global institution. So this set of institutions at the national and global level, whose job it is primarily, above all, to keep financial stability, were totally blindsided by the financial crisis. This is a club of people. They all play golf together at Jackson Hole once a year. They know each other. This is not like other areas which don't even have a global governance system or have one that's highly feudalized, like the WHO, which has fiefdoms. You know, all the money in the WHO is at the regional or country level. None of it is in the center. That's not how the IMF works. It has all the money. So how is this? How is it that when you read the evidence of these people to the various committees, they basically say they don't know what's going on? And I attribute this to two broad sets of answers. The one is the power relationships which apply. In other words, they did know what was going on. They did realize that the US housing bubble was a bubble, but actually they had zero power because the US ignored them. And I have a vignette in the book about Bob Rubin not even knowing when the IMF was doing a surveillance mission in the US, Bob Rubin, the Treasury Secretary. You know, if you work in a developing country and the IMF is doing a surveillance mission, if you're the finance minister, you must probably go to the airport and roll out the red carpet for them and clear your diary for a week for them. So one is not knowing and not caring, and the institutions having no power. The second is capture of these institutions by the ideologies which locked them in to believing that somehow rational individual actions sum to collectively good outcomes. And so a capture of the whole institutional structure by a mindset which was benign and, of course, highly politically motivated. No one was prepared to prick the bubble, which could be politically disastrous for people in the short term. A short-termism, an opportunism in this that became characteristic of it. So power relationships which blind the institution, and ideologies which blind the institution to the big structural changes, but also rooted behind this a failure to comprehend the structural changes in the world. One of the most revealing pieces of evidence that I've read around the financial crisis is that where people discuss why they didn't understand the data. And what they basically are saying in this is that they didn't understand the structural breaks. They didn't understand the aggregate implications of the derivatives trades that were happening. And a fundamental problem with these institutions is that the skill sets of these institutions are also extremely slowly evolving. Many of them are civil servants. Many of them have lifelong employment. But the technologies and the way the world's operating are revolutionary. And so you have this mismatch between evolutionary mindsets, and I certainly point to myself in this. I've been on the audit committee of banks, and I was part of the problem in Washington in not seeing it. And a system world, people in the trading rooms who are on a completely different level of understanding. So this disconnect of skills. So in finance, I think because finance was such a dismal failure, and because I think it continues to be, I'm not optimistic that we'll avoid the next financial crisis. I worry even more about the global governance system. When you look at pandemics, which is another one of my case studies, we have a global system which notionally works, and we're very happy that we haven't had a global pandemic really since the Spanish flu of that sort of scale and magnitude in the 1918-19 period. But all the ingredients are there for a much more severe pandemic, mainly the level of density of people, urbanized number of people, the level of connectivity. And so when you model, for example, the spread of the swine flu or any other one of these pandemics, you see it exactly replicating airline traffic, with big nodes like Heathrow becoming key in this. and rising problems like antibiotic resistance. When everyone does the rational thing and takes antibiotics, or businesses feed increasingly antibiotics to their animals across the whole chain, and they even use antibiotics now to stop barnacles growing on ships, getting into water, getting into everywhere, creating antibiotic resistance. So I believe that the complacency around it is dangerous and will have extremely lethal outcomes. And we need to think about these contagions that are the underbelly of globalization much more strongly. I use migration as an example because I feel passionately about it. I believe that it's the very uneven nature of globalization, which globalizes everything except labor movements, which is the source of great poverty in the world, and all sorts of other problems. Migration has always been historically the way that people escaped disaster, poverty, famine, wars, conflict. That's certainly why all of us are here. We all would not be here without migration in the past. Some of us recent, over the past generations, some of us maybe hundreds of years ago, but it's the same force. It's also the source of endogenous growth and many other things. But as walls have gone up over the last 100 years, and increasingly so after the last 20, we have this imbalance. And even on very simple things like pension portability or the definition of who a migrant is, we have no agreement. So I push very strongly for a catch-up in that area. Cyber is an interesting area because it is the new nervous system of the world. And there's no structure for cyber. There's no global agreements. There's no even regional agreements on cyber. And the Oxford Martin School, which I direct, has just been awarded the UK Cyber Centre. So we will become the home, to the public at least, part of the UK Cyber Initiative as part of a global initiative. But this is a multi-tiered requirement, which ranges on the technology front to legal and jurisdiction questions. If there's someone from Russia or somewhere else that steals their identities, for example, there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. We certainly can't go and have them arrested. There's no agreements around that sort of thing. So there's a massive black hole in international governance around cyber, which I believe, even before one gets to the cyber criminalities and the use of cyber by national governments, requires urgent catch-up. And then, of course, there's climate change as another classic example of an issue which has become pressing, where there's a stuttering start to global agreement. A whole series of global negotiations, and Doha's another one, the Doha round, which started in 2001, which we remain stuck, have tried to move forward these agendas, but most of them end again in this problem of divided nations. So the first part of the book really sets out why I think these global issues are so significant, using some indicative examples, which I've highlighted now, and highlights why they cannot be dealt with at the national level or even by small groups of countries. The second part of the book seeks to draw various lessons from good and bad examples of global governance. Why do some things work? And some things do work. You know, I fly around a lot. I never worry about international air traffic control. That works. The International Postal Union works. There's a whole lot of things that work. Meteorological associations work. Despite massive changes in technology and language barriers and all the other things that bedevil some of the other areas. And the reason these things tend to work is because no one has an interest in free riding. No one has an interest in not following the rules, and the rules are relatively simple. You fly at this altitude and you fly on that side of the airways. So any one nation has no free rider interest. The problem arises where any one nation or group of nations would benefit by not joining up into global agreement, or would benefit by not even making the effort, free riding in one way. And so the question of externalities, of free rider problems, of the management of the global commons is absolutely central to the understanding of global governance. And so I do spend a bit of time thinking about this and thinking about cooperative games, what we learned from them, and how it is that on some issues we are able to overcome these problems of cooperation and not on others. I worry a great deal about this because I think this problem is getting much worse as incomes rise and as people have more and more individual choice. These are obviously two wonderful things, incomes rising and more choice. But if we all think that we have the right to decide what fish to eat, or what transport form to take, or how much consumption of anything to consume, that's of course great for us, but it can lead to disastrous collective outcomes. And so as we get richer and as we have more rights, we also take on more responsibility. We take on more responsibility because the external or spillover effects or all of our actions are greater on everyone else. And as there are more and more of us, now 7 billion and growing to 9 billion at least over the next 25 years, going up this income curve, this impact becomes overwhelming. And so we urgently need to think about global governance, because if we don't, I believe it will overwhelm us through negativities. When citizens see connectiveness, integration as a source of threat, not opportunity, they turn inwards. And I think it is no accident that the financial crisis has been followed by growing xenophobia, nationalism, and protectionism. It's both because of what I characterize as the blizzard of complexity. In other words, we don't understand source and destination of problems. We don't understand cause and effect because there's so many interrelated, interconnected variables in a highly complex world. So we want to try and make things simpler, and that's very logical. We want to say, let's make our government responsible, and we want to look at our politicians in the eyeballs and try and hold them accountable. And these are very rational tendencies. The problem is that as we get more integrated, the problems become more and more joined up. And actually, the only way to manage them is by being more and more joined up in our governance. So this balance between local and global is one that is of critical importance. The rise of UKIP to 24% in the UK, the desire of the UK to pull out of Europe, the desire of Scotland to pull out of the UK are local examples of people's responses to the financial crisis and to perceived, I believe, complexity and risks arising from globalization. I think they're absolutely right on the risk front. I think they're absolutely wrong in terms of what's the appropriate response. So we need to find a way that governments can be both more accountable locally but more joined up globally. And so in the third part of the book, I go through a series of thought experiments and looking at some of the experiences of what's worked and about how one can reform global governance and these institutions to better cope with this pressing demand. I'm more convinced that the number of countries and the number of demands on the different actors is a source of problems. I am not optimistic about a 202 nation United Nations working as a system. And I say that with great regret because it is a beautiful organization with a beautiful charter. But the idea that 202 nations will be able to agree anything, whether it's through centralized bodies like the Security Council on Syria, whether it's broader negotiations on climate, I'm more and more pessimistic about. So what does one do? Effectiveness and legitimacy are absolutely intertwined in this. And of course, what the UN has a great deal of is legitimacy. But if you cannot be effective, it undermines your legitimacy as well. So one without the other are meaningless in terms of governance. Both are necessary, and the challenge is, I believe, to design systems which can be both legitimate and effective. It's a pity that coalitions of the willing have been so badly damned in terms of their name by the Iraq experience, because my own sense is that increasingly, on some issues, that is the road we're going to have to go down. On climate, for example, I believe that one could create a cluster of constituencies which would, for example, account for, let's say, 80% of the emissions and a representative sample of affected countries, say Bangladesh and a few others, which would constitute a legitimate alliance of institutions, countries, some which would not be at the national level but would include, for example, big cities and other actors, to move an agenda forward. And through a series of widening circles, one could bring other actors in. Of course, free riding remains an issue. Let's say the US does not sign up to this. How does one pressure it? But I believe they're operating through other actors, like, for example, California as a state or New York as a state and cities, as well as through consumer pressures, and perhaps extending this into other arenas, although my friend Pascal Lamy would hit me on the head for saying this, like trade, and have carbon taxes at the border, I believe is the way to go. I do not believe we can wait on some issues until we get enough consensus to be able to move forward on something as critical and time critical as climate. And obviously the issue with climate is every day we wait for agreement is a lock-in over the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years of fossil systems. So some things are very urgent and I believe can be moved through widening coalitions of willing partners, if they're legitimate. And legitimacy remains absolutely key to this. Other things cannot be. You cannot get an agreement on cyber or on pandemics, for example, that leaves out a whole bunch of countries, because then those become the source of critical instabilities in the system and free riding. This is particularly true of pandemics. But it doesn't mean that everyone has to be committed to the same degree. One could imagine, for example, global SWAT teams that are with the capabilities to monitor and to manage pandemics at source. Although one would have to get over the sorts of reservations that I highlight in the book of countries like Indonesia on this. The basic issue, as I see it, is that we are in a period of a building perfect storm. A perfect storm arising out of the successes of globalization, the other side of our speed of development is this. Growing instability in the system, growing inequality arising out of globalization as the returns to those that aren't connected fall further and further behind those that are more connected, as well as growing instability through our pressure on resources, land, water, atmosphere, oceans, and our collective use of goods like antibiotics and others, which have real externalities associated with them. So on the one hand, we have this building pressure. On the other hand, we have a power vacuum in global governance. We have a handover, and it's perhaps slightly undiplomatic to say that on the day of a G8 meeting, which hopefully will make breakthroughs, but I won't hold my breath on that one. A power system which is really stuck in a completely bad old age, unfit for purpose, a flash in the pan of a G20, which hasn't lived up to expectation, is becoming another photo op opportunity for home audiences. So we have this increasing divide. Hopes that the BRICS will step up to the plate, but I think increasing evidence that they're not yet ready and won't be for the next 10 or 15 years. The big announcement of the past BRIC meeting was a BRIC bank, a good maybe significant, incremental step, but not one that I believe is calibrated at any sort of scale which relates to the global challenges. So an increasing drift in global affairs, in global governance. Benign neglect of the system, but worse than that, turning the back on some of the critical issues that need resolving. So we as citizens need to get more active. We need to be able to juggle more than one ball at a time. We need to be able to campaign on many issues. We need to be able to be effective in convincing our fellow citizens that the way to manage globalization is not by turning your back on it, but embracing connectivity, embracing this, and ensuring that the instabilities inherent in the system don't overwhelm it. If they do, we back into fragmented worlds, into worlds which will be particularly disastrous for the poor of the world, who haven't yet benefited from increased opportunity and connectivity. So inclusive globalization is absolutely at the heart of this. Jobs not least in the advanced and the developing countries, and ensuring that people feel that they have a shared future. It's only then, when we have that sort of ethical basis, that this is a shared project, that we have a shared planet, that I think we can begin to engage in it. And this book is an attempt to raise that awareness. Thank you.